Ladies and gentlemen, today at the beginning I wish to thank my old friend Mr. Sudarshan, who specially invited me for this occasion, and also Colonel Sharma, who called me up several times. To start with, yes, you have already known that I had done some work on myths, and it was my doctoral thesis when I researched on this area, Tibet and China. Now, distinctively, these two societies, despite their geographic proximity, differ in their worldview, and their myths also actually reflect what kind of distinction they have. Now, to start with some aspects of myths, basically we have been taught since our school days, there is a difference between history and myths. Now, in this area of discourse, we have seen how, history has been sometimes confused with myths. And what we tend to hear more and more is inculcated or imbibed in ourselves through lessons of history and other aspects of life in the form of myth, but actually it is something which we miss at times. History with myths and myths with histories. So therefore, it is important, of course, probably you have seen through my web page that I have worked on the aspect of history as well, contemporary Indian history. So we will have to really go into the details of questioning the very existence of myth and the confusion it takes to acquire a sort of form of history at times, which is not true. Now here, when I saw this, the theme of this book, I was interested because I have worked on this area for a long time. So basically, to say that our poets, for example, in this part of the world, I was thinking that several poems I have found in this book. Of course, I didn't have the chance earlier to see this book. This morning I checked on the website which Colonel Saab had sent me online. So I chanced to see those things, online, and then I saw this book. Now, the idea which I got, some poets have dealt some Western figuratives or mythical figures in their poems. I was pondering over this point. Western poets don't draw metaphors from Gita or Granth Sahib or any other holy book of ours in India. They tend to draw allegories or metaphors from Bible or testaments. Now, why our poets have to go into the Greek, Latin, Roman myths? We have much more in our own myths. Our poets of India or this subcontinent do not need to draw allegories from other myths. We have much more and much richer mythical figures in our own stories. Katha Sarit Sagar, Panchatantra, Veda, Upanishad, Puran, lots of things are there. Now we don't need to at all delve into the figuratives offered by the West. So my point is this, that when I went through the book, I was more enchanted or sort of rethinking of this aspect, that our poets don't need to go into the Western figures, number one. Number two is we have heard and reheard the narrations and re-narrations of Mahabharata, Ramayana, or any other ancient scriptures of our country. But very little has been done in terms of interpretation and reinterpretation of those tales and figures. Mainstream myths, for example, you have Ramayana, Mahabharata, we have heard and reheard 100 times. But to think about what actually happened, why these stories emerged, and how did it become so important for us to learn from them? Now, 5 Pandavas pitted against 100 Kauravas. How could they win the war? So the essence is this, that it is the human beings pitted against the nature, Panchabhuta, Kshiti, Ap, Tej, Marut, Vyam. Now these 5 elements, no one can conquer. No one can conquer. Even 100 brothers who were actually representative of the human mind, the various forms of human mind. Duryodhan was representative of the ego. Duryodhan, you cannot conquer, or unconquerable. Now, Dushasan, uncontrollable. So these aspects have not been interpreted or reinterpreted to educate the school children. Now that is why our school children have become actually crows with peacock's crown. You know, there is a story about it, that the crows are there trying to disguise themselves as peacocks. Neither this nor that. They cannot have any kind of kekadhvani. It will be ka 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 only, cawing in the wilderness. So therefore, our children have not been taught to imbibe a pride in our own stories, nor myths, nor the reality. It's a very, very weird situation altogether. Therefore, I wish to point out that through this book, probably there is an initiative to bring along certain aspects of myths, trying to recreate those things. For example, I have gone through some stories like the poems like Why Sita, modern day Mahabharata, Surpanakha, Ekalavya, Yujutsu and Radha's dialogue, Ravana's wife asking her husband certain kind of queries she has in her mind. And then Sita, actually challenging Ram's position. Now, this is not a sort of kind of religious discourse, as pointed out, that we are not here to challenge anything. It is only the poet's liberty that has the kind of supremacy. Now, in these contexts, I would like to say that in our own country, in our own culture, for example, I can see a lot of people belong, they come from Punjab. Now, in Punjab itself, there are 5 rivers, Panchab. Now, how these names got distorted? Satluj, for example. How many people would remember that it was Shatadru? It was not Satluj. Shatadru, Vipasha. That became Beas. Now, therefore, all these names have been lost. Toponymy, for example, the study of the names of these geographical places, for example, you see, Karnavati, Pataliputra. Now, all these names have been lost. Now, how many people will ever remember that Ajaya Meru Prithviraj Chauhan's Ajay Meru became Ajmer after that, the invincible peak. Lakshmanavati became Lucknow. Now all these names have been lost. Now how many people would go deeper to study all these things? And our children will be imbibed with some sense of pride in our own history. Now instead, they are being taught in IITs and other institutions, even including my own institution, and they are serving the other countries, not our own country. So therefore, this myth and manthan means churning. What do we churn then? The soul, the spirit, and the mind? Or what? Now, another aspect comes to my mind that you see in Vedas when we read, just now somebody was speaking about Vedas, representation. I think Dr. Pogel was there showing the paintings outside. Now, monotheism, for example, this monotheism was there reflected in the Vedas. Now suddenly, we see an emergence of different types of figures, like the polytheism, in the form of idols across the land of India. Now we can question, where did it emerge from? Shankaracharya the two, when he went into the revivalism of Hinduism, now gradually, before that, of course, he found that there had been a sort of rampant eating habit of animals and birds. People used to eat. Now, how to stop that? To bring religion into the play. And then all these animals and birds were assigned as Vahana of various deities. And therefore, in this course of action, you stop the rampant killing of birds and animals. And therefore, all these birds and animals, you see 33 crores of deities. Only the goat and the chicken were spared. So that means those rishis, munis were only thinking of eating these two. And so therefore you assign all the others to these deities to stop the killing. So one aspect, as I have told you, this Mahabharata's reinterpretation part, that, when we see Dhritarashtra, Dhritarashtra means what? You are actually putting the state into ransom. Ransom means you are blind, so blind towards your own son, Duryodhan, that the ego becomes supreme over the state. And as we have seen in the modern times, in our own days, that ego runs supreme over the state affairs. And therefore we have mismanagement and misgovernance. So therefore, we have to draw these lessons from these myths. Now to come back to my own field of study, for example, Chinese. Now we see that how Panchatantra and all these Hindu rituals or the olden days of India have to have some reflection over the Chinese characters or the evolution of Chinese characters. Yes, I have talked several times among the Chinese audience as well who didn't know about it. And therefore, we come to know that lots of things have to be taught and retaught. Even those people of their own land, they don't know about their own culture. You see, modernism or the globalization, to say, neo-globalization. I would talk about neo-globalization when we come to these points, that how American culture or the predominant Western culture has actually distorted our even thinking, the process of thinking. The thinking process actually is, something to do with what we are educated with. The books, the textbooks. Instead of saying that this is our history, many often you will at times you will find that how actual facts are being put under the carpet to suit the interpretation of the rulers of the day. So therefore, myth is something and history is something else. History is not myth and myth is not history. But there is a correlation when we draw parallels between India and China. We see very often myths are made to be projected as history. Very often we see that. And therefore we will have to be very careful when we talk about myths or reflecting myths through recreated poems like this, through this book. I would suggest that at the same time, as you are doing some social work among the children in the schools, I think we need to have books, series of books to be published so that our school children or the next generations to come, they know what is the exact history of our own country, because many often we see that, these are not at all histories. These are fictions. These are fictions, absolutely fictions. So, in my sort of career in JNU, I took some steps which were considered bold or much daring at times, because some people kind of sought to question that why did you take such bold step, does it not offer any risk to you? Because interpretation of history at times, challenges the pre-existing narrative of the time. So, and lots of, linguistic kinship is there, which have to be explored. Linguistic kinship in the sense that Sanskrit, as a mother language of all these Indo-European tongues, have to be taught and retaught in schools. For example, in French class or German, Spanish, Russian, all these have their Sanskrit roots, but very few people will be taught about it. Now, if you don't draw correlation or you show that this is the root, the dhatu roop, shabd roop, and all these things, now how people will know about that, yes, indeed what we speak in our day-to-day life is actually related to this root. So we have a very heavy responsibility on our shoulder in that sense. Now the protagonists from our myths, how they have played an active role in remodeling or reshaping our minds, that too have to be, actually reformulated in the form of books. So far as these stories are concerned, we find that most of these stories come from the predominant religious traditions. Now, I would suggest that now for example, we heard that there are stories from Inca civilization, Mayan civilization, and other extinct civilizations across the world. There are Maoris also. Now, there are so-called colonial term aborigines. Now, these things have to be again rethought about, that Australia, for example, as a continent, was again a victim of the white race. Yes. Now, the aborigines, so-called aborigines, the Adivasis, for example. Now, instead of mainstream mythical figures, we can also go into our own Adivasi figures. Santals, Oraos, Hos, Mundas, all have their figures, mythical figures. Now, I have written one article. Of course, you can go to my webpage and find out that Santals, Oraos also had some stories similar to Manthan. And they too have this tortoise as a figure, earthworm as a figure. Now these things, the terrestrial beings, they have become actually the totems of these tribes. Now, instead of only banking upon the predominant religious traditions, I would suggest our poets can also think about the tribal figures, the so-called tribal figures, the Adivasi figures, to be precise. Now, we have heard about the mythical figures of the dragons. Now, this dragon has come actually from Naga, the Nag. Now, the crocodile, the Nag, the snake, which is dangerous for human life, those were actually figures to be feared about, scared of. People were scared of these things, and therefore the congregation of various animals amalgamated together formed the dragon. In China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, we all find different forms of dragon. And if you go deeper into those intricate parts of it, you will find that it is nothing else but the Naga which has transformed itself. So, I appreciate the kind of initiative you have taken, creation and recreation through poetry and art. Interpretation of mythical figures has acquired a new dimension. However, the points which I have just raised, so this sort of the correlative aspect, or where they meet, or where we can do a better thing instead of banking upon the mythical figures of the West, instead of writing about, say, river Styx, we can go into the names like Iravati. You see, Iravati, probably you have known, in Burma there is a huge river called the Iravati. Now, along those banks of that river, many Indians had stayed and resided for ages, but we didn't have any sort of clue. What were they doing there? The history, the tradition which grew along those banks of that river, we don't know about it. So, therefore, we have a splendid responsibility on our shoulder. In future, we can think about doing a better job. Now, recently in China, I was hearing that how Bob Dylan's poetry and singing became important. But don't we have our own versions? Baul singers are there. They are illiterate people, but they sing, and the entire philosophy of life is there in their songs. We have blind poets and bards who sing in trains, buses. You see, probably their songs and the contents of their songs are much richer than Bob Dylan. I can assure you that. So therefore, when we talk about these things, we have to introspect what we are and how we can feel proud about our own ethics, about our own myths, mythical figures, and how we can better understand our own self. As I have highlighted about the toponymy part of it, that various names of this country, the place names, have hidden history. And we have to delve deep into those historical parts of it and to understand that how we can, have a better understanding about our own self. Thank you very much.